The Enchanted April. Written by Elizabeth von Arnim. Narrated by Ryan. A note to the reader. Welcome to this modernized edition of The Enchanted April, Elizabeth von Arnim's beloved 1922 novel about transformation, renewal, and the magic of a Mediterranean spring. The story begins in the dark, rainy streets of London, where two mismatched women, Mrs. Wilkins and Mrs. Arbuthnot, spot a small advertisement in the newspaper offering a medieval Italian castle to rent for the month of April. Driven by a desperate need for a rest and an escape from their dreary lives and husbands, they decide to take a leap of faith. To share the cost, they invite two other strangers to join them: the beautiful but exhausted young socialite Lady Caroline and the stern, elderly widow Mrs. Fisher. What follows is a beautiful, light-hearted comedy of manners. As the four women settle into the sun-drenched gardens of San Salvador, surrounded by wisteria, lilies, and the blue sea, the beauty of their surroundings begins to work a subtle magic on each of them. Old grudges fade, heavy hearts grow light, and unexpected love begins to bloom. In this edition, we have modernized the early 20th century vocabulary and simplified complex sentence structures to make the story highly accessible and flowing for modern readers, students, and language learners, while preserving the full spirit, humor, and details of the original classic. We hope it brings a touch of sunshine to your day. Chapter 1. It all started at a women's club in London on a gloomy February afternoon. The club was uncomfortable, and the weather was miserable. Mrs. Wilkins, who had traveled from her home in Hampstead to do some shopping, had just finished lunch at the club. She picked up the Times from the table in the smoking room. As she listlessly scanned the personal ads in the agony column, her eyes caught this. To those who appreciate wisteria and sunshine, a small medieval Italian castle on the Mediterranean coast is available to rent, fully furnished, for the month of April. Essential staff will stay on. Contact Z, Box 1000 The Times. That was the seed of the idea. But like many life-changing moments, the person who conceived it had no idea what was happening at the time. In fact, Mrs. Wilkins was so completely unaware that her April plans for the year had just been decided that she dropped the newspaper with a sigh of irritation and resignation. She walked over to the window and stared drearily out at the rain-soaked street. A medieval castle was not for someone like her, even a small one. The Mediterranean coast in April, the wisteria, the sunshine, none of that was in her reach. Such luxuries were only for the wealthy. And yet, the advertisement was addressed to those who appreciate these things. That technically meant her, because she certainly appreciated them, far more than anyone knew and more than she had ever admitted. But she was poor. In the entire world, her only personal possession was £90. She had saved it carefully, pound by pound, over several years out of her clothing allowance. She had scraped this nest egg together at her husband's suggestion to serve as a shield against a rainy day. Her clothing allowance, given to her by her father, was £100 a year. Because of this, Mrs. Wilkins' clothes were what her husband, who urged her to save, called modest and sensible, while her acquaintances, on the rare occasions they spoke of her at all, since she was easily ignored, called her a complete sight. Mr. Wilkins, a lawyer, was a big supporter of saving money, except when it came to his food. He didn't call saving on food thrift, he called it bad housekeeping. But he had nothing but praise for the kind of thrift that crept into Mrs. Wilkins' wardrobe and ruined her style. "You never know," he often said.
"When a rainy day will come, you might be very glad to find you have a nest egg. Indeed, we both might."
Staring out the club window onto Shaftesbury Avenue, her club was cheap but convenient for traveling back to Hampstead where she lived, and close to Shoolbred's department store where she shopped. Mrs. Wilkins stood there for a long time. In her mind's eye, she saw the Mediterranean in April, the wisteria, and the wonderful opportunities enjoyed by the rich. Meanwhile, her physical eyes watched the depressing, soot-colored rain falling steadily on the crowd of umbrellas and splashing buses. Suddenly, she wondered if this cold, wet afternoon was exactly the rainy day Mellersh was Mr. Wilkins, had warned her to prepare for. and wasn't escaping this terrible whether to go to a small medieval castle, exactly what Providence had intended for her savings. Only a portion of her savings, of course, perhaps a very small part. Since the castle was medieval, it might be run down, and surely rundown places were cheap to rent. She wouldn't mind a bit of wear and tear, since you didn't have to pay to repair damage that was already there. In fact, by lowering the rent, the dilapidations practically paid you back. But what nonsense to even think about it. She turned away from the window with the same mix of irritation and resignation with which she had laid down the paper. She walked across the room toward the door, intending to get her raincoat and umbrella, fight her way onto a crowded bus, and head to Shoolbred's to buy some fish for Mellersh's dinner. Mellersh was very picky about fish and would eat only sole or occasionally salmon. Just then, she noticed Mrs. Arbuthnot sitting at the table in the middle of the room. Mrs. Arbuthnot was a woman she knew by sight. She also lived in Hampstead and belonged to the club. She was currently sitting at the magazine table, completely absorbed in the front page of the Times. Mrs. Wilkins had never spoken to Mrs. Arbuthnot before. Mrs. Arbuthnot belonged to one of the church groups that analyzed, classified, and helped the local poor. In contrast, when Mrs. Wilkins and Mellersh did go out, they attended parties hosted by impressionist painters who were common in Hampstead. Mellersh had a sister who was married to one of these artists living near the Heath. Because of this connection, Mrs. Wilkins was pulled into a social circle that felt completely unnatural to her, and she had grown to dread discussing art. She was expected to comment on paintings, but never knew what to say. She usually just muttered, "Marvelous," and felt like a fraud. But nobody minded. Nobody listened, and nobody paid attention to Mrs. Wilkins anyway. She was the kind of person who went unnoticed at parties. Her thrifty, outdated clothes made her practically invisible. Her face was plain, her conversation was quiet, and she was terribly shy. If your clothes, face, and conversation are all forgettable, thought Mrs. Wilkins, who knew her own limitations, what is actually left of you at a party? She was also always overshadowed by Wilkins. He was a clean-shaven, handsome man who brought an air of respectability to any gathering just by showing up. Wilkins was highly respected, well-liked by his senior partners, and admired by his sister's artistic circle. He made sensible judgments on art, spoke prudently, and never said too much or too little. He gave off the impression of keeping a carbon copy of everything he said. He was so visibly reliable that people meeting him at parties often became unhappy with their own lawyers and eventually switched to Wilkins. Naturally, Mrs. Wilkins was completely ignored. She, his sister had once declared in a highly authoritative tone, should stay at home. But Wilkins couldn't leave his wife at home. As a family lawyer, it was important for him to have a wife and show her off. During the week he took her to parties, and on Sundays he took her to church. Being relatively young, he was 39, and wanting to attract wealthy elderly clients, he couldn't afford to skip church. It was there that Mrs. Wilkins had become familiar with Mrs. Arbuthnot, though they had never exchanged a word. Mrs. Wilkins had watched her lead the Sunday school children into the pews. Mrs. Arbuthnot would arrive at the head of the procession exactly 5 minutes before the choir, organizing the boys and girls neatly into their seats. She would have them kneel for a quick prayer and stand them back up just as the organ swelled, the vestry door opened, and the choir and clergy marched out. Mrs. Arbuthnot had a sad face, yet she was highly efficient. This combination puzzled Mrs. Wilkins. Mellersh had always told her, especially on days when she could find only cheap fish for dinner, that efficient people were never depressed, and that doing one's job well automatically made a person bright and cheerful. There was nothing bright or cheerful about Mrs. Arbuthnot, though she handled the Sunday school children with routine efficiency. But when Mrs. Wilkins turned from the window and saw her at the club, Mrs. Arbuthnot was not behaving routinely at all. She was staring fixedly at one section of the front page of the Times, holding the paper completely still. Her eyes didn't move. She was just staring, her face looking like a patient, disappointed Madonna. Acting on an impulse that surprised even herself, the shy and quiet Mrs. Wilkins changed her plans. Instead of heading to the cloakroom and then to Shoolbred's for Mellersh's dinner, she stopped at the table and sat down directly across from Mrs. Arbuthnot. It was a long, narrow wooden table, so they were sitting very close to each other. Mrs. Arbuthnot didn't look up. She kept gazing with dreamy eyes at that one spot on the newspaper. Mrs. Wilkins watched her for a moment, trying to find the courage to speak. She wanted to ask if she had seen the advertisement. She didn't know why it was so important, but she felt a strong urge to ask. How silly to be too afraid to speak, she thought. Mrs. Arbuthnot looked so kind, and yet so unhappy. Why couldn't two unhappy people comfort each other with a little real, natural conversation? Why couldn't they talk about how they truly felt, what they wanted, and what they still hoped for? Mrs. Wilkins was certain that Mrs. Arbuthnot was reading the exact same ad. Her eyes were focused on the very same column. Was she also picturing what it would be like? The color, the fragrance, the bright light, and the soft sound of the sea lapping against warm rocks. Color, fragrance, light, and the sea. Instead of Shaftesbury Avenue, wet buses, the fish counter at Shoolbred's, the subway to Hampstead, dinner, and then the exact same routine tomorrow, the next day, and forever. Suddenly, Mrs. Wilkins found herself leaning across the table.
"Are you reading about the medieval castle and the wisteria?"
She heard herself ask. Naturally, Mrs. Arbuthnot was surprised, but she was not half as surprised as Mrs. Wilkins was by her own boldness. Mrs. Arbuthnot had never really looked at the messy, tall, awkward woman sitting across from her. She saw a small freckled face and large gray eyes almost hidden under a wet floppy hat. She stared at Mrs. Wilkins for a moment before answering. She was reading about the medieval castle and the wisteria, or rather, she had read it 10 minutes ago and had been lost in a dream of light, color, fragrance, and the soft lapping of the sea against warm rocks ever since.
Why do you ask me that?
She asked in her low, serious voice, which she had developed from years of working patiently with the poor. Mrs. Wilkins flushed, suddenly looking very shy and embarrassed.
"Oh, only because I saw it too, and I thought somehow."
She stammered. Out of habit, Mrs. Arbuthnot, whose mind was trained to categorize and organize people, began to wonder where this woman fit. If she had to classify her, under what heading would she go?
"And I know you by sight."
Mrs. Wilkins rushed on. Like many shy people, once she started talking, she couldn't stop, terrified into speaking more just by the sound of her own voice.
"Every Sunday. I see you every Sunday in church."
"In church," Mrs. Arbuthnot repeated.
"And this seems like such a wonderful thing. This advertisement about the wisteria and—"
Mrs. Wilkins, who must have been at least 30, stopped speaking and shifted awkwardly in her chair like an embarrassed schoolgirl.
"It just seems so wonderful."
She burst out.
"And it's such a miserable day."
She sat looking at Mrs. Arbuthnot with the pleading eyes of a locked-up dog. This poor thing, thought Mrs. Arbuthnot, whose life was dedicated to helping others, needs advice. She patiently prepared to offer it.
"If you see me in church,"
she said kindly.
"I assume you live in Hampstead too."
"Oh yes," said Mrs. Wilkins. Her head drooped slightly on her long, thin neck, as if the very memory of Hampstead weighed her down. "Oh yes." "Where?" asked Mrs. Arbuthnot, beginning to gather the facts. But Mrs. Wilkins only laid her hand gently and affectionately over the advertisement, as if the printed words themselves were precious.
"Perhaps that's why this seems so wonderful,"
she said.
"No, I think it's wonderful regardless,"
Mrs. Arbuthnot said, forgetting the facts for a moment and sighing softly.
"Then you were reading it."
"Yes," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, her eyes turning dreamy again.
"Wouldn't it be wonderful?"
Mrs. Wilkins whispered. "Wonderful," Mrs. Arbuthnot agreed. Her face lit up for a second, then faded back into its usual patient expression.
"Very wonderful, but it's no use wasting time thinking about such things."
"Oh, but it is."
Mrs. Wilkins replied quickly, surprising them both. It was a strange response coming from someone in such a plain coat and skirt, a crumpled hat, and messy hair.
"Just thinking about it is worth it. It's such a change from Hampstead. And sometimes I really believe that if you want something hard enough, you get it."
Mrs. Arbuthnot watched her patiently, In what category would she place her? Perhaps, she said, leaning forward slightly.
You could tell me your name, if we are to be friends.
She smiled her gentle smile.
As I hope we will, we should start at the beginning.
Oh yes, of course. I'm Mrs. Wilkins.
She said. She blushed when Mrs. Arbuthnot didn't immediately respond.
I don't expect my name means anything to you. Sometimes it doesn't mean much to me either. But
she looked around as if seeking help.
I am Mrs. Wilkins.
She didn't like her name. She thought it sounded small and cheap, with a silly twist at the end like the curled-up tail of a pug. But there was nothing she could do about it. She was a Wilkins, and a Wilkins she would remain. Her husband always urged her to introduce herself as Mrs. Mellersh Wilkins, but she only did that when he was close enough to hear. She felt adding Mellersh made the name Wilkins sound even worse, like putting an overly grand name on the gates of a small suburban villa. When he first suggested adding Mellersh, she had objected. After a long pause, Mellersh was far too cautious to speak without a pause, during which he presumably made a mental record of his comment. He had said, highly offended.
But I am not a villain.
He had looked at her with the expression of a man hoping, for the 100th time, that he hadn't married a fool. Of course he wasn't a villa, Mrs. Wilkins had assured him. She had never suggested he was, and she hadn't meant it that way at all. She was just thinking. The more she tried to explain, the more Mellersh worried that he had indeed married a fool. They had a long, silent argument, conducted with dignified silence on his part and earnest apologies on hers, about whether she had meant to call him a villa. I believe she had thought when it was finally over that people will argue about anything when they haven't spent a single day apart for 2 whole years. What we both need is a holiday. My husband, Mrs. Wilkins continued, trying to explain herself to Mrs. Arbuthnot,
is a lawyer, he.
She searched for something positive to say about Mellersh and settled on.
He is very handsome.
Well, said Mrs. Arbuthnot kindly.
That must be very nice for you.
Why? Asked Mrs. Wilkins. Because, said Mrs. Arbuthnot, slightly surprised. She was used to having her charity circle pronouncements accepted without question.
Because beauty and good looks are a gift, and if they are used properly.
She trailed off. Mrs. Wilkins' large gray eyes were staring at her, and Mrs. Arbuthnot suddenly realized she was speaking like a schoolteacher lecturing a child. It was a habit she had developed from speaking to audiences who couldn't disagree or interrupt. But Mrs. Wilkins wasn't listening. A vivid picture had suddenly flashed across her mind. She saw the two of them sitting together under a massive trailing wisteria that climbed over the branches of an unfamiliar tree. She saw herself and Mrs. Arbuthnot clearly as if they were already there. And behind them, bright in the warm sunshine, were the old gray walls of the medieval castle. She stared at Mrs. Arbuthnot, completely tuned out. Mrs. Arbuthnot stared back, fascinated by the expression on Mrs. Wilkins' face. It was filled with excitement, glowing and shifting like water under sunlight rippled by a breeze. In this moment, if she had been at a party, people would have looked at Mrs. Wilkins with real interest. They stared at each other, Mrs. Arbuthnot with curious surprise and Mrs. Wilkins like someone who had just seen a vision. Of course, that was how they could do it. She couldn't afford it on her own, and even if she could, she wouldn't want to go all alone. But she and Mrs. Arbuthnot could go together. She leaned across the table.
Why don't we try to rent it?
She whispered. Mrs. Arbuthnot's eyes widened. Rent it. Yes, Mrs. Wilkins said, still whispering as if they were sharing a secret.
Instead of just sitting here saying, how wonderful, and going back to Hampstead without doing anything. Going back to the same dinners and the same fish we've dealt with for years, and will keep dealing with for years to come. In fact,
Mrs. Wilkins blushed deeply, frightened by her own boldness but unable to stop.
I see no end to it. There is no end. So there ought to be a break, a little pause, for everyone's sake. It would actually be unselfish of us to go away and be happy for a while, because we would come back much nicer people. Everyone needs a holiday after a while.
But how do you mean, get it?
Asked Mrs. Arbuthnot. Take it, Mrs. Wilkins said. Take it.
Rent it, hire it, go there.
But do you mean you and me?
Yes, between the two of us, we can share the cost so it only costs half. And you look exactly like you want it as much as I do. You look like you need a rest, like you need something happy to happen to you.
But we don't even know each other.
Just think how well we would know each other if we went away together for a month. And I've saved money for a rainy day, and I'm sure you have too. And this is the rainy day. Just look at it outside.
She is unbalanced, thought Mrs. Arbuthnot, yet she felt a strange thrill.
Think of getting away for a whole month, from everything to heaven.
She shouldn't say things like that, Mrs. Arbuthnot thought, thinking of the vicar. Yet the idea of a rest, a complete escape, felt incredibly tempting. Habit, however, steadied her. Using her familiar, patient tone, she said,
But heaven isn't somewhere else, it is here and now, we are told so.
She became very serious, speaking as she did to the poor.
Heaven is within us. We are told that on the highest authority. You know the poem about the kindred points, don't you?
Oh yes, I know them.
Mrs. Wilkins interrupted impatiently.
The kindred points of heaven and home.
Mrs. Arbuthnot continued, determined to finish her sentence.
Heaven is in our home.
It isn't, Mrs. Wilkins said flatly. Mrs. Arbuthnot was shocked.
Oh, but it is. It is there if we choose to make it so.
I do choose, and I do try to make it, and it isn't.
Mrs. Wilkins replied. Mrs. Arbuthnot fell silent. She, too, had her doubts about home sometimes. She looked at Mrs. Wilkins uneasily, feeling a desperate need to classify her. If she could just put Mrs. Wilkins under a proper heading, she felt she would regain her own balance, which felt dangerously shaky. She hadn't had a holiday in years either. The advertisement had set her dreaming, and Mrs. Wilkins' excitement was contagious. Watching her glowing face, Mrs. Arbuthnot felt as if she were being woken up from a long sleep. Clearly, Mrs. Wilkins was unbalanced. Mrs. Arbuthnot had met unbalanced people before, and they had never affected her own stability. But this woman was making her feel completely wobbly. She felt a sudden, deep urge to escape, away from her strict guideposts of God, husband, home, and duty, and just be happy for once. Which was wrong, of course. It was absolutely wrong. She had her own savings in the post office savings bank, but the idea of drawing them out to spend on herself was absurd. Surely she couldn't do such a thing. Surely she wouldn't abandon her duty, the poor, and the sick just to go to Italy. A trip to Italy would be wonderful, but life was about having the strength to resist doing the things you wanted to do. To Mrs. Arbuthnot, the 4 pillars of life were God, husband, home, and duty. She had rested her head on these facts years ago, after a period of great misery, using them like a pillow. She was terrified of being shaken awake, so she tried hard to find a heading for Mrs. Wilkins to steady her own mind. Looking at her uneasily, she decided to temporarily classify her under nerves. It was possible she belonged under hysteria, which often led to madness, but Mrs. Arbuthnot had learned not to rush people into final categories. She had made mistakes in the past and felt terrible remorse. Yes, nerves. The woman probably didn't have enough work to keep her busy, Mrs. Arbuthnot thought. She was rudderless, blown about by sudden impulses. Nerves was definitely her category. Poor little thing, she thought, her compassion returning. All she could see across the table was Mrs. Wilkins' eager, shy face and thin shoulders, and a childish longing in her eyes for happiness. No, fleeting things like vacations didn't bring true happiness. Mrs. Arbuthnot had learned during her long marriage to Frederick. She had married him at 20 and was now 33, where true joy was found. It was found only in living for others and at the feet of God. Frederick was the kind of husband who drove a wife to the feet of God early in marriage. It had been a short but painful journey. It had taken the entire first year of their marriage, and every step had been a struggle that felt stained with her own heart's blood. But that was over now. She had found peace. Frederick, once her passionately loved groom, had become second only to God on her list of duties and patience. He was a duty she performed dutifully, made quiet by her prayers. For years, she had been happy only by forgetting about personal happiness. She wanted to keep it that way. She wanted to shut out everything that made her long for beautiful things again.
I would like to be friends.
She said earnestly.
Won't you come visit me or let me visit you? Whenever you feel like talking, I'll give you my address.
She said, searching her purse for a card.
So you won't forget.
Mrs. Wilkins ignored the card. It's so funny, Mrs. Wilkins said, as if she hadn't heard.
But I see us both, you and me, in that medieval castle this April.
Mrs. Arbuthnot felt uneasy again. Do you, she asked, trying to remain stable under the woman's visionary gray eyes, do you?
Don't you ever see things in a flash before they happen?
Mrs. Wilkins asked. Never, said Mrs. Arbuthnot. She tried to give her usual wise, patient smile that she used with the poor, but she couldn't manage it. The smile faded. Of course, she said in a quiet voice, almost as if she were worried the vicar or the savings bank would hear.
It would be incredibly beautiful, incredibly beautiful.
Even if it were wrong.
Mrs. Wilkins said.
It's only for a month.
That, Mrs. Arbuthnot began, ready to explain why that was the wrong way to think, but Mrs. Wilkins cut her off. Anyway, Mrs. Wilkins said.
I'm sure it's wrong to go on being good for so long that you become miserable. And I can tell you've been good for years, because you look so unhappy.
Mrs. Arbuthnot opened her mouth to protest, but Mrs. Wilkins went on.
And I've done nothing but duties and things for others since I was a girl, and I don't think anyone loves me any better for it. And I long. Oh, I long for something else. Something else.
Was she going to cry? Mrs. Arbuthnot felt extremely uncomfortable and sympathetic. She hoped she wouldn't cry here in this public room with people walking by. But Mrs. Wilkins, after searching her pockets, pulled out a handkerchief, blew her nose, blinked quickly, and looked at Mrs. Arbuthnot with a shy, quivering smile. Would you believe, she whispered, looking ashamed,
that I've never spoken to anyone like this in my life? I don't know what has come over me.
It's the advertisement, Mrs. Arbuthnot said, nodding seriously. Yes, Mrs. Wilkins said, dabbing at her eyes.
And the fact that we're both so miserable.
Chapter 2. Of course, Mrs. Arbuthnot was not miserable. How could she be, she asked herself, when God was taking care of her? But she let that comment pass for now without arguing. She was convinced that Mrs. Wilkins was a fellow human being in desperate need of her help, and not just with physical things like warm boots and blankets, but with the more delicate help of true understanding and finding the right words. She soon realized that the right words were not about living for others, prayer, or finding peace by giving oneself to God. Mrs. Wilkins had her own messy, confusing replies to those ideas, which were hard to answer on the spot. Instead, the right words were a simple suggestion. It couldn't hurt to write a letter inquiring about the advertisement. It would be non-committal, just a simple question. What worried Mrs. Arbuthnot about this idea was that she wasn't suggesting it just to comfort Mrs. Wilkins. She wanted to write it because of her own secret longing for the medieval castle. This was very disturbing. Mrs. Arbuthnot was used to directing, leading, advising, and supporting others. Except for Frederick, she had long ago learned to leave her husband in God's hands. Yet here she was, being led and influenced by a simple newspaper ad and a rambling stranger. It was highly unsettling. She couldn't understand her sudden desire for what was, after all, pure self-indulgence, especially since she hadn't felt such a desire in years.
There's no harm in simply asking,
she said in a quiet voice, almost as if the vicar, the savings bank, and all the poor people waiting for her help were listening and judging.
It's not like it commits us to anything.
Mrs. Wilkins agreed, also in a quiet but shaking voice. They stood up at the same time. Mrs. Arbuthnot was surprised by how tall Mrs. Wilkins actually was and walked over to a writing desk. Mrs. Arbuthnot wrote to Z, Box 1000, The Times, asking for details. They asked for all the information, but the only detail they really cared about was the rent. They both felt that Mrs. Arbuthnot should write the letter and handle the business side. Not only was she used to organizing things and being practical, but she was also older, calmer, and certainly wiser. Mrs. Wilkins didn't doubt this for a second. Even the way Mrs. Arbuthnot parted her hair suggested a deep calm that could only come from wisdom. Yet even if Mrs. Arbuthnot was older and wiser, her new friend seemed to be the one pushing things forward. She was disorganized, but she had a strong pull. She possessed a strange, contagious energy that led you on. And the way her mind jumped to conclusions, wrong ones, of course, like assuming Mrs. Arbuthnot was miserable, was quite disconcerting. Despite her new friend's chaotic energy, Mrs. Arbuthnot found herself sharing her excitement and longing. Once the letter was dropped into the mailbox in the lobby and could not be retrieved, both she and Mrs. Wilkins felt a sudden pang of guilt. "It only shows," Mrs. Wilkins whispered as they turned away from the mailbox.
"How perfectly good we've been our entire lives. The very first time we do something our husbands don't know about, we feel guilty."
"I'm afraid I can't say I've been perfectly good," Mrs. Arbuthnot protested gently. She felt uncomfortable with Mrs. Wilkins' habit of jumping to conclusions again, especially since she hadn't said anything about her guilt.
"Oh, but I'm sure you have. I can see you've been good, and that's why you're not happy."
She really shouldn't say things like that, Mrs. Arbuthnot thought. I must try to help her stop doing that. Aloud, she said seriously,
I don't know why you keep saying I'm not happy. When you know me better, I think you'll find that I am, and I'm sure you don't really mean that being good makes a person unhappy.
"Yes, I do," Mrs. Wilkins replied.
"Our kind of goodness does. We have achieved it, and we are unhappy. There are miserable kinds of goodness and happy kinds. The kind of goodness we'll experience at the medieval castle, for instance, is the happy sort."
That is, assuming we actually go there.
Mrs. Arbuthnot said, trying to keep things grounded. She felt that Mrs. Wilkins needed to be held back a bit.
After all, we've only written to ask. Anyone can do that. I think it's highly likely the terms will be impossible, and even if they aren't, we probably won't want to go by tomorrow anyway.
"I see us there,"
Mrs. Wilkins replied. All of this was very unsettling. As Mrs. Arbuthnot walked through the rainy streets on her way to a charity meeting she was supposed to speak at, her mind was in an unusual state of turmoil. She hoped she had appeared calm, practical, and sensible to Mrs. Wilkins, hiding her own excitement. But in reality, she was deeply moved, happy, guilty, and afraid all at once. She was feeling the exact range of emotions of a woman who had just come from a secret meeting with a lover, though she didn't realize it. That was exactly how she looked when she arrived late on the stage. She normally looked open and honest, but now she looked almost secretive as she faced the crowd of wooden faces waiting to hear her talk about helping the poor of Hampstead. Her audience, however, was mostly convinced that they needed help themselves. She looked like she was hiding a scandalous but delightful secret. The usual clear honesty on her face was gone, replaced by a nervous, pleased expression that would have made a more worldly audience assume she had just come from a passionate romance. "Beauty, beauty, beauty." The words kept repeating in her mind as she stood on stage talking about sadness to the small audience. She had never been to Italy. Was that really what her savings were meant for? Although she didn't approve of how Mrs. Wilkins assumed their future was already destined, as if thinking or struggling was completely useless, she was still influenced by it. Mrs. Wilkins had the eyes of a prophet. Some people were like that, Mrs. Arbuthnot knew, and if Mrs. Wilkins had actually seen her at the medieval castle, struggling against it did seem like a waste of time. Still, to spend her savings on her own pleasure. The source of her savings had been questionable, but she had at least hoped they would be used for a good cause. Was she really going to redirect this money from its intended purpose, which was the only thing that justified her keeping it, just to give herself a vacation? Mrs. Arbuthnot spoke on and on. She was so practiced at these speeches, she could have delivered them in her sleep. At the end of the meeting, Her mind was so filled with secret visions of Italy that she barely noticed that nobody in the audience was moved, and certainly nobody had donated. But the vicar noticed. He was disappointed. Usually, his good friend Mrs. Arbuthnot was much more successful, and even more unusually, she didn't even seem to care. "I can't imagine," he said to her irritably as they left.
What is wrong with these people? Nothing seems to move them.
"Perhaps they need a holiday," Mrs. Arbuthnot suggested. The vicar thought this was a very strange reply. "In February," he called after her sarcastically.
Oh no, not until April.
Mrs. Arbuthnot replied over her shoulder. Very odd, the vicar thought, very odd indeed. He went home and was not particularly kind to his wife that evening. That night, in her prayers, Mrs. Arbuthnot asked for guidance. She felt she should pray that the medieval castle had already been rented by someone else, settling the matter for good. But she couldn't bring herself to do it. What if that prayer was answered? She couldn't risk it. Besides, she reasoned with herself and almost pointed out to God, if she spent her savings on a vacation, she could easily save up another nest egg. Frederick was always trying to give her money. It would only mean that her donations to the parish charities would be slightly smaller for a little while. And then, the next nest egg could be the one that was purified by being spent on a good cause. Mrs. Arbuthnot had no money of her own and was forced to live on Frederick's income. Her very savings were the fruit of past sin. The way Frederick made his living was a constant source of distress for her. He wrote highly popular, yearly biographies of royal mistresses. History was full of kings who had mistresses, and even more mistresses who had kings. Because of this, he had published a book of scandalous memoirs every year of their marriage, and there were still stacks of historical ladies waiting to be written about. Mrs. Arbuthnot was helpless. She had to live on the proceeds of his books. After the success of his book on Madame du Barry, he had bought her a terrible sofa with soft, plush cushions. It felt wrong to her that this reminder of a dead French sinner should sit in her very home. Because she was a good person who believed that morality was the foundation of happiness, the fact that she and Frederick made their living from historical scandal was a secret source of sadness for her. The more scandalous the lady, the more his books were read, the more money he gave his wife, and the more she spent helping the poor after adding a small amount to her savings. She saved in case people stopped reading about wickedness and Frederick needed her support. The local parish flourished because of the bad behavior of historical ladies like Du Barry, Montespan, Pompadour, and Ninon de l'Enclos. The poor were the filter through which the money passed, coming out clean on the other side. That was the best she could do. She had tried to think of a better solution in the past, but she had found it too difficult, just as she had found Frederick, and had left them both to God. None of this money was spent on her own house or clothes. Those remained plain and simple, except for the large soft sofa. It was the poor who benefited. Their very boots were bought with the proceeds of historical sins, but it was so difficult. Groping for guidance, Mrs. Arbuthnot prayed until she was exhausted. Ought she perhaps to refuse to touch the money entirely, avoiding it as she would avoid the sins that paid for it? But then what would happen to the poor children's boots? She had asked the vicar for advice, and through much cautious, evasive language, he had ultimately voted in favor of the boots. At least she had excelled at persuading Frederick, when he first started this successful career, to publish the memoirs under a pen name so she wouldn't be publicly associated with them. Before their marriage, he had been a blameless librarian at the British Museum. Hampstead read his books with joy, having no idea that the author lived right among them. Frederick was practically unknown in Hampstead. He never attended local social events. Whatever he did for fun was done in London, and he never spoke of where he went or who he saw. He might have been completely friendless for all he ever mentioned to his wife. Only the vicar knew where the parish money came from, and he considered it a matter of honor never to speak of it. Her house was at least free from the spirits of those historical ladies, because Frederick did all his writing away from home. He had 2 rooms near the British Museum where he did his research. He went there every morning and returned long after his wife was asleep. Sometimes he didn't return at all for several days. Then, he would suddenly appear at breakfast, having let himself in late the night before, looking cheerful, healthy, and happy. He was a well-fed, full-blooded man who was content with the world. He was always happy to give her money, and she was always gentle, making sure his coffee was exactly how he liked it. He seemed very happy. She often thought that no matter how much you tried to categorize life, it remained a mystery. Some people were impossible to place, and Frederick was one of them. He bore no resemblance to the young Frederick she had married. He didn't seem to need any of the things he used to say were so important: love, home, sharing thoughts, and being completely focused on each other's interests. After early, painful attempts to hold him to the ideals they had started with, attempts that had hurt her deeply and ruined the Frederick she thought she knew, she had finally placed him at the top of her prayer list and left him to God. She had loved him too deeply to do anything else now. He had no idea that whenever he left the house, her blessing went with him, hovering around him like a quiet echo of their past love. She didn't dare think of him as he used to be during the wonderful early days of their romance. Her child had died, and she had no one of her own to love. The poor became her children, and God became the focus of her love. What could be happier than this life? She sometimes asked herself, yet her face and eyes remained sad. Perhaps when we're old, perhaps when we are both quite old, she would think wistfully. Chapter 3. The owner of the medieval castle was an Englishman named Mr. Briggs, who was currently in London. He wrote to them explaining that the castle had enough beds for 8 people, not counting servants, 3 sitting rooms, battlements, dungeons, and electric lighting. The rent was £60 for the month, with the servants' wages extra. He also requested references, assurances that the second half of the rent would be paid, since the first half was due in advance, and a character reference from a lawyer, a doctor, or a clergyman. He was very polite in his letter, explaining that asking for references was standard practice and merely a formality. Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins hadn't thought about references, and they had never imagined the rent would be so high. They had pictured something like 3 guineas a week, or even less, since the place was described as small and old. £60 for a single month. The price staggered them. Mrs. Arbuthnot immediately visualized boots, endless rows of sturdy boots that £60 could buy for the parish children. In addition to the rent, they would have to pay the servants' wages, food, and train tickets there and back. As for references, they seemed like an impossible obstacle. It felt impossible to provide them without making their secret vacation plans public. Both of them had wanted to keep things quiet. Even Mrs. Arbuthnot, tempted for once to be less than completely honest because it saved so much trouble, agreed that they should tell their respective social circles, which luckily didn't overlap, that they were going to stay with a friend who owned a house in Italy. It was true as far as it went. Mrs. Wilkins insisted it was perfectly true, though Mrs. Arbuthnot had her doubts. Mrs. Wilkins said it was the only way to keep Mellersh quiet. Spending her own money just to travel to Italy would make him furious. What he would say if he knew she was renting a medieval castle, she preferred not to think. It would take him days to say it all, even though it was her own money, and not a single penny of it had ever belonged to him. "But I expect," Mrs. Wilkins said.
"Your husband is exactly the same. I think all husbands are alike in the end."
Mrs. Arbuthnot said nothing, because her reason for hiding the trip from Frederick was the exact opposite. Frederick would be only too happy to see her go. He wouldn't mind at all. In fact, he would find her sudden self-indulgence and worldly behavior amusing. He would mockingly tell her to have a great time and not to rush back, with a crushing lack of interest. To her, it was far better to be missed and complained about by a husband like Mellersh than to be pushed out the door with Frederick's detachment. Being missed and needed, for whatever reason, was better than the complete loneliness of not being missed or needed at all. So she remained silent, letting Mrs. Wilkins jump to her own conclusions. Still, for a whole day, they both felt their only choice was to give up the medieval castle. It was in making this bitter decision that they realized just how desperately they wanted to go. Then Mrs. Arbuthnot, who was skilled at finding ways out of difficulties, came up with a solution to the reference problem. At the same time, Mrs. Wilkins had a vision that showed them how to reduce the rent. Mrs. Arbuthnot's plan was simple and highly successful. She took the entire rent in person to the owner, drawing it directly out of her savings bank. Once again, she felt secretive and apologetic, as if the bank clerk knew she was spending the money on personal pleasure. Carrying the £60 in £10 notes in her handbag, she went to the owner's address near the Brompton Oratory and paid the full amount up front, waiving her right to pay only half in advance. When the owner saw her soft dark eyes, her parted hair, her plain clothes, and heard her serious voice, he told her not to worry about references.
It will be all right,
he said, writing a receipt.
Please sit down. Nasty weather today, isn't it? You'll find the old castle has plenty of sunshine, whatever else it might lack. Is your husband going?
Mrs. Arbuthnot, unused to anything but absolute honesty, looked troubled. She began to stammer incoherently, and the owner immediately assumed she was a war widow, since other widows were usually old, and felt like a fool for asking. "Oh, I'm sorry," he said, blushing all the way to his blonde hair.
I didn't mean to.
He checked the receipt he had written.
Yes, I think that's all set,
He said, standing up to hand it to her. Taking the money, he smiled. Mrs. Arbuthnot was very pleasant to look at. Now, he added,
I'm richer and you're happier. I have the money and you have San Salvator. I wonder who got the better deal. I think you know,
Mrs. Arbuthnot said with a sweet smile. He laughed and opened the door for her. He wished the meeting weren't over so quickly. He would have liked to invite her to lunch. She reminded him of his mother and his nurse, kind and comforting, but she also had the benefit of not actually being either of them.
I hope you like the place,
He said, holding her hand for a moment at the door. Her hand, even through her glove, felt reassuring. It was the kind of hand a child would want to hold in the dark.
In April it's just a mass of flowers, and then there's the sea. You must wear white, you'll fit in perfectly. There are actually several portraits of you there. Portraits? Madonnas, you know. There's one on the stairs that looks exactly like you.
Mrs. Arbuthnot smiled, said goodbye, and thanked him. Without any trouble, she had placed him in his proper category. He was an artist with an enthusiastic personality. She shook hands and left, leaving him wishing she had stayed longer. After she was gone, he realized he probably should have asked for those references, if only to seem businesslike. But he could no more ask for references from this sweet, serious lady than he could from a saint. Rose Arbuthnot, her letter making the appointment lay on the table. It was a pretty name. So that difficulty was solved. But there was still the other problem, the heavy toll the rent took on their savings. This was especially true for Mrs. Wilkins, whose savings compared to Mrs. Arbuthnot's were like a tiny quail egg compared to a large duck egg. This problem was solved by a sudden idea of Mrs. Wilkins. They would advertise in the personal column of the Times for 2 more ladies to join them and share the expenses. This would immediately cut their rent share from a half to a quarter. Mrs. Wilkins was willing to spend her entire £90 on this adventure, but she knew that if it cost even a penny more, she would be in a terrible position. The thought of going to Mellersh and saying, "I owe money," was terrifying. It would be bad enough if she had to tell him.
I have no savings left.
But at least she would be comforted knowing the money had been her own. She was willing to spend her last penny, but not a single cent that didn't belong to her. If her share of the rent was reduced to £15, she would have a safe buffer for other expenses. They could also save money on food by eating olives from their own trees and catching fish from the sea. Of course, they realized they could reduce the rent even more by inviting more people. They could invite 6 more ladies instead of 2, since there were 8 beds in total. But if those 8 beds were placed in pairs in 4 bedrooms, they wouldn't want to find themselves locked in a bedroom at night with a stranger. Besides, they felt that too many people would ruin the peace. They were going to San Salvator for quiet, rest, and joy, and 6 other women, especially in their bedrooms, might disrupt that. However, there seemed to be only 2 women in England interested in joining them, as they received only 2 replies to their advertisement.
Well, we only need 2 anyway.
Mrs. Wilkins said, recovering quickly, though she had imagined a huge rush of applicants.
I think having a choice would have been nice.
Mrs. Arbuthnot said.
You mean because then we wouldn't have to choose Lady Caroline Distur? I didn't say that.
Mrs. Arbuthnot gently protested.
We don't have to take her.
Mrs. Wilkins said.
Just one more person would help us a lot with the rent. We don't have to take two.
But why shouldn't we take her? She seems like exactly what we want.
Yes, she does in her letter, Mrs. Wilkins said doubtfully. She felt very intimidated by the prospect of Lady Caroline. As surprising as it might seem, Mrs. Wilkins had never actually met a member of the aristocracy. They interviewed Lady Caroline, and then they interviewed the other applicant, a Mrs. Fisher. Lady Caroline came to the club on Shaftesbury Avenue. She seemed to have only one main goal in life, to get away from everyone she had ever known. When she saw the club, Mrs. Arbuthnot, and Mrs. Wilkins, she was sure this was exactly what she wanted. She would be in Italy, a country she loved. She wouldn't be staying in hotels, which she hated. She wouldn't be staying with friends, whom she disliked. And she would be in the company of strangers who would never mention anyone she knew, simply because they moved in completely different social circles. She asked a few questions about the fourth woman and was satisfied with the answers. Mrs. Fisher of Prince of Wales Terrace was a widow, and she too would be unfamiliar with Lady Caroline's friends. Lady Caroline didn't even know where Prince of Wales Terrace was. It's in London, Mrs. Arbuthnot explained. Is it? Lady Caroline asked. It all sounded incredibly peaceful. Mrs. Fisher was unable to come to the club because she walked with a cane, as she explained in her letter. So Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins went to visit her. But if she can't even walk to the club, how will she travel to Italy? Mrs. Wilkins wondered aloud.
We shall hear that from her own lips.
Mrs. Arbuthnot replied. From Mrs. Fisher, in response to polite questions, they learned only that sitting on a train was not the same as walking around, which they already knew. Aside from her cane, however, she seemed like an ideal fourth companion, quiet, educated, and elderly. She was much older than them or Lady Caroline. Lady Caroline had told them she was 28, but not so old that her mind had slowed down. She was very respectable and still wore black, even though her husband had died 11 years ago. Her house was filled with signed photographs of famous Victorians, all of whom she claimed to have known when she was a child. Her father had been a famous critic, and in his house she had met almost everyone of importance in literature and art. Carlyle had scowled at her. Matthew Arnold had held her on his lap. Tennyson had teased her about the length of her ponytail. She proudly showed them the photographs on her walls, pointing out the signatures with her cane. She didn't share any details about her late husband, nor did she ask about theirs, which was a huge relief. In fact, she seemed to assume that they were also widows. When she asked who the fourth lady was and was told it was Lady Caroline Distur, she asked,
Is she a widow too?
When they explained that she was unmarried, she said with distant friendliness,
All in good times.
But Mrs. Fisher's distraction, she seemed completely focused on the famous people she used to know, and a good part of the interview was spent listening to her stories about Carlyle, Meredith, Matthew Arnold, and Tennyson, was actually a good thing. She only wanted to sit quietly in the sun and remember the past. That was exactly what Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins wanted in a companion, someone who would sit quietly in the sun, remembering the past, and rouse themselves on Saturday evenings just enough to pay their share. Mrs. Fisher also mentioned she loved flowers, recalling a weekend she spent with her father at Box Hill.
Who lived at Box Hill?
Mrs. Wilkins interrupted. She was fascinated by Mrs. Fisher's stories, excited to meet someone who had actually known these legendary figures, heard them speak, and touched them. Mrs. Fisher looked at her over her glasses in surprise. In her eagerness to hear all the details before Mrs. Arbuthnot dragged her away, Mrs. Wilkins had already interrupted several times with questions that Mrs. Fisher found ignorant. Meredith, of course, Mrs. Fisher replied rather shortly.
I remember a particular weekend.
Did you know Keats?
Mrs. Wilkins interrupted eagerly. After a pause, Mrs. Fisher replied with dry reserve that she had not known Keats or Shakespeare.
Oh, of course, how silly of me.
Mrs. Wilkins cried, turning red.
It's just because the classics still seem so alive, don't they? As if they were still here and about to walk into the room, and you forget they are dead. In fact, you know they aren't really dead, certainly not as dead as you and I are right now.
She assured Mrs. Fisher, who watched her closely over her glasses.
I actually thought I saw Keats the other day.
Mrs. Wilkins rambled on, nervous under Mrs. Fisher's gaze.
In Hampstead, crossing the road in front of the house where he used to live.
Mrs. Arbuthnot stood up and said they must be going. Mrs. Fisher did nothing to stop them.
I really thought I saw him.
Mrs. Wilkins protested, looking at both of them for belief, her face flushing, unable to stop talking because of Mrs. Fisher's steady gaze.
I believe I did see him. He was dressed in.
Even Mrs. Arbuthnot looked at her now and gently said they would be late for lunch. At this point, Mrs. Fisher asked for references. She had no desire to spend 4 weeks locked up with somebody who hallucinated. It was true that there were 3 sitting rooms, a garden, and battlements at San Salvador, so she could easily avoid Mrs. Wilkins. But it would be very unpleasant if Mrs. Wilkins suddenly claimed to see Mr. Fisher. Mr. Fisher was dead, and she wanted him to stay that way. She didn't want to be told he was walking around the garden. The only reference she actually cared about, since she was too old and respectable to care about social status, was one regarding Mrs. Wilkins' mental health. Was she normal? Was she an ordinary, sensible woman? Mrs. Fisher felt that if she got even one contact, she could find out what she needed. So she asked for references. Her visitors were so surprised. Mrs. Wilkins was immediately silenced, that she added,
It is standard practice.
Mrs. Wilkins found her voice first.
But aren't we the ones who should ask for references from you?
Mrs. Arbuthnot agreed. They were the ones taking Mrs. Fisher into their group, not the other way around. In response, Mrs. Fisher leaned on her cane, walked to her desk, and firmly wrote down 3 names. She handed them to Mrs. Wilkins. The names were so respectable and grand that reading them was enough. The President of the Royal Academy, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Governor of the Bank of England. Who would dare disturb such important figures to ask if their friend was respectable?
They have known me since I was a child.
Mrs. Fisher said. It seemed everyone had known Mrs. Fisher since she was a child.
I don't think references are appropriate between decent women.
Mrs. Wilkins burst out, feeling cornered. She knew the only reference she could give was the local department store, Shoolbred's, and she had little confidence in that since it was based entirely on Mellersh's fish orders.
We aren't doing business. We don't need to distrust each other.
Mrs. Arbuthnot said with sweet dignity.
I'm afraid references bring a business-like tone to our holiday that we don't want. We won't check yours, and we won't give you any of ours, so I suppose you won't want to join us.
She offered her hand to say goodbye. Looking at Mrs. Arbuthnot, who inspired trust in everyone she met, Mrs. Fisher realized she would be foolish to miss this chance to spend April in Italy. She and this calm woman could surely handle the eccentric one if she had any episodes. Taking Mrs. Arbuthnot's hand, she said,
Very well, I will waive references.
She waived references. As they walked to the station in Kensington High Street, the two couldn't help thinking Mrs. Fisher's tone was rather grand. Even Mrs. Arbuthnot thought she could have chosen better words. By the time they reached the station, warmed up by the walk and the struggle on the crowded pavement, Mrs. Wilkins actually suggested waiving Mrs. Fisher.
If anyone is going to waive anyone, let it be us,
she said eagerly. But Mrs. Arbuthnot calmed Mrs. Wilkins down. Once they were on the train, Mrs. Wilkins smiled and said that at San Salvador, Mrs. Fisher would find her level.
I see her finding her level there,
she said, her eyes bright. Mrs. Arbuthnot sat with her hands folded, thinking about how she could help Mrs. Wilkins see a little less, or at least keep her visions to herself. Chapter 4. It had been arranged that Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins, traveling together, would arrive at San Salvador on the evening of March 31st. The owner, who had given them directions, understood their desire to avoid starting their vacation on April Fool's Day. Lady Caroline and Mrs. Fisher, who didn't know each other yet and were under no obligation to keep each other company on the journey, were to arrive on the morning of April 2nd. This way, everything would be prepared for the two who, despite paying equal shares, felt a bit like guests. The end of March brought some very difficult moments. Mrs. Wilkins, with her heart in her throat and her face showing a mix of guilt, fear, and determination, finally told her husband that she had been invited to Italy. He refused to believe it. Of course he refused to believe it. Nobody had ever invited his wife to Italy before. There was no precedent for such a thing. He demanded proof. The only proof was Mrs. Arbuthnot, and Mrs. Wilkins succeeded in bringing her over, but only after desperate begging and pleading. Mrs. Arbuthnot had never expected to face Mr. Wilkins and tell him something that wasn't the whole truth, and the experience made her realize what she had suspected for a while. She was drifting further and further from her high moral standards. Indeed, the entire month of March was full of anxious, unpleasant moments. It was an uneasy month. Mrs. Arbuthnot's conscience, which she had pampered for years, could not reconcile what she was doing with her high standards of right and wrong. It gave her no peace. It nudged her during her prayers. It interrupted her requests for divine guidance with uncomfortable questions like, "Aren't you a hypocrite? Do you really mean that? Wouldn't you actually be disappointed if your prayer was answered?" The long-lasting cold, wet weather also sided with her conscience, causing far more sickness than usual among the poor. They had bronchitis, fevers, and endless distress. And here she was, spending precious money on a trip just to make herself happy. One woman indulging herself while crowds of people suffered. She couldn't look the vicar in the eye. He didn't know, and nobody else knew, what she was planning to do. From the very beginning, she couldn't look anyone in the face. She made excuses to avoid giving charity speeches. How could she stand up and beg people for money when she was spending so much on her own selfish pleasure? Nor did it help her conscience when she asked Frederick for money. In an attempt to make up for the savings she was spending, she told him she would be grateful if he could give her some money, and he immediately wrote her a check for £100. He asked no questions. She blushed deeply. He looked at her for a moment and then looked away. It was actually a relief to Frederick that she was willing to take some money from him. She immediately gave the entire sum to her charity organization, but this only made her feel more tangled in moral doubts than ever. Mrs. Wilkins, on the other hand, had no such doubts. She was convinced that taking a vacation was perfectly appropriate and that spending her hard-earned savings on happiness was right and beautiful.
Think of how much nicer we will be when we get back,
she said to Mrs. Arbuthnot, trying to cheer up her pale friend. No, Mrs. Wilkins had no doubts, but she did have fears. March was a stressful month for her as well, with Mr. Wilkins coming home daily for dinner and eating his fish in the silence of false security. Furthermore, life has a way of happening at the most inconvenient times. It really is amazing how awkward things can get. Mrs. Wilkins, who was very careful all month to cook only the foods Mellersh liked, shopping and hovering over the stove with unusual care, succeeded so well that Mellersh was actually pleased. He was so pleased that he began to think he might have married the right wife after all, instead of the wrong one, as he had often suspected. The result was that on the third Sunday of the month, Mrs. Wilkins had planned to break the news on the fourth Sunday, since there were 5 Sundays in March and they were leaving on the 5th. After a wonderful lunch where the Yorkshire pudding melted in his mouth and the apricot tart was so good he ate the whole thing, Mellersh sat by the warm fire as hail pelted the window and said,
"I am thinking of taking you to Italy for Easter."
He then paused, waiting for her shocked and grateful excitement. None came. The room was completely silent, except for the hail hitting the window and the crackle of the fire. Mrs. Wilkins couldn't speak. She was dumbfounded. The next Sunday was the day she had planned to tell him, and she hadn't even figured out what she was going to say yet. Mr. Wilkins, who hadn't traveled abroad since before the war, had grown increasingly disgusted by the persistent rain and wind. He had slowly decided he wanted to escape England for Easter. His business was doing well, and he could easily afford a trip. Switzerland was pointless in April, but Easter in Italy sounded classic. He would go to Italy, and since it would look bad if he didn't take his wife, he decided to bring her along. Besides, a second person is always useful in a country where you don't speak the language, useful for holding things and waiting with the luggage. He had expected her to be thrilled. The lack of any reaction was unbelievable. He concluded she hadn't heard him. She was probably lost in some silly daydream. It was a shame how childish she remained. He turned his head, their chairs were facing the fire, and looked at her. She was staring straight into the flames, which must have been why her face was so red. "I am thinking," he repeated in a loud, clear, educated voice, speaking sharply because her lack of attention was unacceptable.
"Of taking you to Italy for Easter, did you hear me?"
Yes, she had heard him, and she had been marveling at the incredible coincidence, really most extraordinary. She was just about to tell him how she had been invited by a friend. Easter, too. Easter was in April, wasn't it? Her friend had a house there. In fact, driven by fear, guilt, and surprise, Mrs. Wilkins had been even more disorganized and rambling than usual. It was a terrible afternoon. Mellersh, deeply offended that his planned treat was ruined, questioned her with extreme severity. He demanded that she refuse the invitation. He insisted that since she had accepted it without consulting him, she right to cancel. Finding her unexpectedly stubborn, he then claimed he didn't believe she had been invited to Italy at all. He refused to believe in this Mrs. Arbuthnot he had never heard of before. It was only when the gentle Mrs. Arbuthnot was brought over, with great difficulty, since she hated saying anything less than the whole truth, and verified his wife's story that he finally believed them. He couldn't help but believe Mrs. Arbuthnot. She had the same effect on him as she did on transit workers. She barely had to say a word. But that didn't help her conscience, which kept reminding her that she had left him with an incomplete impression. "Do you see any real difference," her conscience asked, "between an incomplete impression and a flat-out lie? God sees none." The rest of March felt like a bad dream. Both Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins were exhausted and felt terribly guilty. When they finally left on the morning of the 30th, there was no excitement or holiday feeling at all.
"We've been too good, much too good."
Mrs. Wilkins kept whispering as they walked up and down the platform at Victoria Station, having arrived an hour earlier than necessary.
"And that's why we feel like we're doing something wrong. We've been browbeaten. We aren't even real human beings anymore. Real human beings are never as good as we've been. To think we should be so happy right now, actually starting our trip, and it's ruined just because we've spoiled them. What have we done, I'd like to know, except want to go away by ourselves for once and get a little rest from them?"
Mrs. Arbuthnot paced patiently, not asking who them referred to because she already knew. Mrs. Wilkins meant their husbands, assuming Frederick was just as angry as Mellersh about his wife leaving. In reality, Frederick didn't even know his wife was gone. Mrs. Arbuthnot, who never spoke about him, had said nothing of this to Mrs. Wilkins. Frederick was too close to her heart to discuss. He was busy finishing another one of his scandalous books and had been away almost constantly for the past few weeks, including the day she left. Why should she tell him beforehand? Certain that he wouldn't care what she did, she simply wrote him a note and left it on the entry table. She wrote that she was going on a month's holiday because she needed a rest, and that Gladys, the capable maid, had instructions to take care of him. She didn't say where she was going. There was no reason to, as he wouldn't care. The day of departure was miserable, windy, and wet. The English Channel crossing was terrible, and they were both very seasick. But once they arrived in Calais and stopped being sick, they felt a wave of happiness. It was there that the true excitement of their adventure finally began to warm their spirits. It hit Mrs. Wilkins first and spread like a warm glow to her pale companion. By the time they reached Calais, where they ordered sole, Mrs. Wilkins specifically wanted to eat a sole that Mellersh wasn't having. Mellersh had already begun to seem less important. None of the French porters knew him, and not a single official in Calais cared a bit about Mellersh. In Paris, they had no time to think about him because their train was late and they barely caught the connection to Turin. By the afternoon of the next day, As they entered Italy, England, Frederick, Mellersh, the vicar, the poor, Hampstead, the club, Shoolbreads, and their endless worries had all faded away like a half-remembered dream. Chapter 5. It was cloudy in Italy, which surprised them. They had expected brilliant sunshine, but it didn't matter. It was Italy, and even the clouds looked thick and beautiful. Neither of them had ever been there before. Both stared out the windows with rapt faces. The hours flew by as long as it was light, and after dark, there was the excitement of getting closer and closer and finally arriving. At Genoa, it had begun to rain. Genoa. Imagine actually being in Genoa, seeing its name written on the station sign just like any other city. At Nervi it was pouring, and when they finally reached Mezzago toward midnight, for their train was late again, the rain was coming down in what felt like solid sheets. But it was Italy. Nothing it did could be bad. Even the rain felt different, straight rain, falling properly on one's umbrella, not like that violently blowing English rain that got in everywhere. And it would stop, and when it did, the earth would be covered in roses. Mr. Briggs, the owner of San Salvatore, had told them,
"Get off at Mezzago and then drive."
But he had forgotten what he knew very well, that Italian trains are often late. He had imagined his tenants arriving at Mezzago at 8 o'clock in the evening, finding a row of carriages to choose from. Instead, the train was 4 hours late. When Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins scrambled down the steep, ladder-like steps of their train car into the dark downpour, their hands full of bags and their skirts sweeping up pools of dirty water, they would have had nothing to drive in if not for the vigilance of Domenico, the gardener at San Salvatore. All the regular carriage drivers had gone home hours ago. Domenico, predicting this, had sent his aunt's carriage, driven by his cousin. Since his aunt and her carriage lived in Castagneto, the village at the base of San Salvatore, the driver wouldn't dare return home without the passengers he had been sent to fetch, no matter how late the train was. Domenico's cousin was named Beppo. He emerged out of the dark where Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins stood, unsure of what to do next after the train had moved on. There was no porter in sight, and it felt like they were standing in the middle of the train tracks rather than on a platform. Beppo, who had been looking for them, bounded out of the darkness and spoke to them in rapid, loud Italian. He was a very respectable young man, but in the dark, with a wet hat slouched over one eye, he didn't look like it. They didn't like the way he grabbed their bags. He certainly didn't look like a porter. However, amidst his flood of words, they recognized the name San Salvatore. They kept repeating it back to him. It was the only Italian they knew, as they hurried after him to keep their bags in sight, stumbling over tracks and through puddles toward a small, high carriage waiting in the road. The carriage's hood was up and the horse stood in deep thought. They climbed inside. The moment they were in, though Mrs. Wilkins was barely settled, the horse woke up with a start and immediately began rushing home, leaving Beppo and the bags behind. Beppo chased after the carriage, shouting at the top of his lungs, and caught the hanging reins just in time. He proudly explained, with what he thought was perfect clearness, that the horse always did that because it was a spirited animal, full of energy, and cared for by Beppo like a son. He assured the ladies they shouldn't be alarmed. He had noticed them clutching each other in fear. But although he was loud, clear, and talkative, they only looked at him blankly. He kept talking as he piled the bags around them, sure they would eventually understand him, especially since he spoke loudly and used simple, helpful gestures. But they both just kept staring at him. He noticed sympathetically that they both had pale, exhausted faces and large, tired eyes. He thought they were beautiful, and their eyes watching him over the pile of bags looked like the eyes of the Virgin Mary. The only thing the ladies said, gently prodding his back as he sat on the driver's box to get his attention, was, "San Salvatore." And each time he answered loudly and encouragingly,
Sai San Salvatore.
"We don't actually know if he's taking us there."
Mrs. Arbuthnot said quietly after they had been driving for what felt like a long time. They had left the paved streets of the sleeping town and were on a winding road. To their left was a low wall, beyond which was a vast black emptiness and the sound of the sea. To their right was something steep and dark, large rocks. They whispered to each other.
No, we don't know.
Mrs. Wilkins agreed, feeling a chill run down her spine. They felt very uncomfortable. It was so late, so dark, and the road was so lonely. What if a wheel broke? What if they met fascists or their opponents? They deeply regretted not staying the night in Genoa and traveling in the daylight the next morning.
But that would have been the 1st of April.
Mrs. Wilkins said quietly.
It is April Fool's Day now.
Mrs. Arbuthnot whispered. So it is, Mrs. Wilkins murmured. They fell silent. Beppo turned around on his box, a worrying habit since he should have been watching the road, and spoke to them again with what he was sure was absolute clarity. How they wished their mothers had made them learn Italian when they were children. If only they could say, "Please sit properly and watch the horse." They didn't even know the Italian word for horse. It was embarrassing to be so ignorant. In their anxiety, as the road twisted around sharp rocks and only the low wall kept them from falling into the sea, they began to gesticulate, waving their hands and pointing ahead to tell Beppo to face forward. He thought they wanted him to drive faster. The next 10 minutes were terrifying as he tried to please them. He was proud of his horse, and it could go very fast. He stood up in his seat, cracked his whip, and the horse bolted forward. The rock seemed to leap toward them. The carriage swayed, the bags shifted, and Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins clung to each other. They clattered and swayed until they reached a hill near Castagneto. The horse, knowing every inch of the road, stopped suddenly at the base of the hill, throwing everything in the carriage into a heap, and then walked up at a snail's pace. Beppo turned around, laughing with pride, expecting their admiration. The beautiful ladies did not laugh back. They just stared, their pale faces looking milky against the dark night. But once they reached the top of the slope, they finally saw houses. The rocks, the low wall, and the sea disappeared, and the loneliness of the road was over. There were no lights on, and nobody saw them pass, but as soon as they entered the village, Beppo yelled Castagneto. Over his shoulder, stood up, cracked his whip, and made the horse dash forward once more.
We will be there in a minute.
Mrs. Arbuthnot told herself, holding on.
We will stop soon.
Mrs. Wilkins told herself, holding on. They said nothing aloud because nothing could be heard over the cracking whip, the clattering wheels, and the encouraging noises Beppo was making at his horse. They anxiously looked for any sign of San Salvador. They had hoped that after the village, a medieval archway would appear, and they would drive through it into a garden and pull up to a brightly lit, open door where the servants stood waiting. Instead, the carriage suddenly stopped. Looking out, they saw they were still in the middle of a village street, surrounded by small dark houses. Beppo threw the reins over the horse's back, confident it wouldn't move, and climbed down. At the same moment, out of nowhere, a man and several boys appeared and began pulling their bags out of the carriage.
No, San Salvador, San Salvador.
Mrs. Wilkins cried, trying to hold onto her bags.
Sai San Salvador.
They all shouted back, pulling.
This can't be San Salvador.
Mrs. Wilkins said to Mrs. Arbuthnot, who sat quietly watching her bags being carried away with her usual patience. She knew she couldn't stop them if they were thieves.
I don't think it is.
She admitted she couldn't help but wonder at God's plans. Had they really been brought here, after all their lies and effort, only to be robbed? She stopped her thoughts and told Mrs. Wilkins they were in God's hands as the boys disappeared with their bags into the night, and the man with the lantern helped Beppo pull the rug off them. For the first time, hearing that they were in God's hands made Mrs. Wilkins feel truly afraid. There was nothing to do but get out. It was pointless to sit in the carriage repeating San Salvador. Every time they said it, Beppo and the other man just shouted it back. If only they had learned Italian when they were young, if only they could say, "Drive us to the door." But they didn't even know the word for door. Such ignorance was not only embarrassing, it was dangerous. It was too late to regret it now. They couldn't stay in the carriage forever, so they got out. The two men opened umbrellas for them and handed them over. This made them feel slightly better because they couldn't believe that thieves would bother to open umbrellas for their victims. The man with the lantern gestured for them to follow him, talking loudly and quickly. Beppo stayed behind. Ought they to pay him? Not if they were about to be robbed and murdered, they thought. You don't pay on such occasions. Beside, he hadn't actually brought them to San Salvador, and he didn't ask for any money as they walked away into the night. They couldn't help but think this was a bad sign. He was asking for nothing now because he would get so much later. They came to some steps. The road ended abruptly at a church and went down into steps. The man held the lantern low so they could see. San Salvador? Mrs. Wilkins asked very quietly before going down. She couldn't go down in silence, even though she was sure no medieval castle was ever built at the bottom of a flight of steps. Again, the echoing reply came.
Sai San Salvador.
They walked down carefully, holding up their skirts just as if they would need them again and weren't about to be murdered. The steps led to a steep path with flat stone slabs in the middle. They slipped on the wet stones, and the man with the lantern held them up politely, talking rapidly.
Perhaps it is all right after all.
Mrs. Wilkins whispered to Mrs. Arbuthnot.
We're in God's hands.
Mrs. Arbuthnot said again, and again Mrs. Wilkins felt afraid. At the bottom of the path, the lantern light flickered over an open square surrounded by houses on 3 sides. The sea was on the 4th side, washing gently over the pebbles. San Salvador, the man said, pointing with his lantern to a dark mass curving around the water like an arm. They stared. They saw the dark mass, and at the top of it a single light. San Salvador? They both asked, disbelieving. Where were their bags, and why had they been forced to get out of the carriage?
Sai San Salvador.
They walked along a quay right at the water's edge. There was no wall here, nothing to stop the man with the lantern from pushing them into the water. But he didn't. Perhaps it really is all right, Mrs. Wilkins suggested. Mrs. Arbuthnot began to agree and stopped talking about God's hands. The lantern light reflected on the wet stones of the quay. To their left, at the end of a jetty, was a red light. They reached an archway with a heavy iron gate. The man pushed it open. This time they went up steps, and at the top was a path winding upward through invisible flowers. They couldn't see them, but the air was filled with their scent. It finally occurred to Mrs. Wilkins that the carriage hadn't driven them to the door because there was no road, only a footpath. That explained why their bags had been carried off. She felt confident they would find their luggage waiting for them at the top. San Salvador was on top of a hill, as a medieval castle should be. At a turn in the path, they saw the light they had seen from the quay, much closer now. She told Mrs. Arbuthnot her theory, and Mrs. Arbuthnot agreed. With real hope, Mrs. Wilkins pointed to the dark outline against the night sky. San Salvador.
Sai San Salvador.
The man replied warmly. They crossed a small bridge over a ravine, then walked along a flat path bordered by long grass and more flowers. The wet grass brushed against their stockings, and the scent of invisible flowers was everywhere. They climbed higher through the trees along a zigzag path. The warm rain was bringing out all the sweet scents. The red light on the jetty dropped further below them. The path wound around the other side of the small peninsula. The jetty and red light disappeared, and they saw distant lights across the water. Mazego, the man said, waving his lantern.
Sai.
They replied, having finally learned the phrase. The man congratulated them in a flood of polite words on their excellent Italian. This was Domenico, the loyal and capable gardener of San Salvador, the main support of the estate. He was polite and intelligent, though in the dark, with his sharp features and swift movements, he looked like a villain. They passed a high wall towering above them, walked under trellises where wet branches brushed against them, and the lantern light flickered over lilies. Finally, they climbed a flight of ancient stone steps, went through another iron gate, and found themselves inside, climbing a vaulted stone stairway that looked like a dungeon. At the top was a wrought iron door, through which shone a flood of bright electric light.
Zeko.
Domenico said, running up the last few steps to push the door open. They had arrived. It was San Salvador. Their bags were waiting for them, and they had not been murdered. They looked at each other's pale faces and blinked solemnly. It was a wonderful moment. Here they were, in their medieval castle at last. their feet touched its ancient stones. Mrs. Wilkins put her arm around Mrs. Arbuthnot's neck and kissed her.
The first thing to happen in this house,
She said softly.
shall be a kiss.
Dear Lottie, Mrs. Arbuthnot said. Dear Rose, Mrs. Wilkins replied, her eyes filling with tears of joy. Domenico was delighted. He loved seeing beautiful ladies kiss. He gave them a warm speech of welcome. Tired as they were, they stood arm in arm, smiling at him without understanding a single word.